Good evening. Great to be here. David, where'd you go? David, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me to Columbia. And for reasons you mentioned, it's a very special place for me because of this connection with my grandfather. And so quite literally, I wouldn't be here without Columbia because you invited me tonight, but if it weren't for my grandfather, I wouldn't have had my wonderful father, and he met my mother here in New York, right around here, and then I came along. But they had the wisdom to move me out of New York to Boston at an early age. I was chumming for some booze. I'm a diplomat, after all. But it's also great to have my aunt and uncle here tonight, who, you guys met in London, didn't you? Okay, so they met in London, and this was good. Oh, okay, well, my story works better if you met in London. So they come over and they get married at our house. I grew up in this little tiny town in Lincoln, Massachusetts, about 4,000 people right outside of Boston. And so it was nice to meet people who had been in London, and I got to hear about London, because up until that point, and so many of you are so young, but those of us of a certain age, back in the 70s, you know, we had like 3.5 channels on TV. So my only experience with the United Kingdom was Monty Python, Doctor Who, and Benny Hill, which was strange. So you sort of balanced out. So thank you for giving me a better sense. And then New York comes in again. So I headed over there 2 years ago, roughly, August of 2013. And I was given lots of advice from my friends, some of whom are in the room today, from New Yorkers who either were British or had spent some time there. And they warned me, and they said, Matthew, beware of the British press. They will build you up and they will tear you down. It's like, okay. So the very next day, I'm still in America at this point. I've been announced that I'm going over there, but I haven't yet gone. And an article in a major newspaper appears in which I am described as a potato with hair. So it's like, great, that's the building up bit. I was just bracing for the tearing down. And then I actually do get over there a few weeks later. It's day 6. And at that point, think back, August 2013, David Cameron goes before Parliament asking for the use of military force against the Assad regime for the use of chemical weapons. And as you remember, it's a big debate here in America, it's a big debate over there. He ends up losing the vote. And after he lost the vote, front page of the #1 most circulated newspaper in the UK is a big thing above the fold. It says, death notice, special relationship, dead, age 67, beloved offspring of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, blah, 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 blah. Funeral to be held at the French embassy. So I get an email from these same friends in New York who had warned me, and they said, well done, Matthew. 7 decades in the making, and you've killed it in less than 7 days. So of course it didn't die that day, and it's still alive and well, and it's complicated, and it's vibrant, and it's vital, and I hope in the question and answer we can get into your suggestions and your thoughts about that. But what brings us today is diplomacy in the digital age, and I was thinking the other thing I'm trying to adjust to in the UK is language, right? Famously similar but different, and you fall into traps. And I remember early on watching the BBC weather, and there's a storm, I mean nothing like today, like a terrible storm ravaging the UK. And there's like, people are like getting swept out to sea, it's a big deal. And I'm watching the BBC, and there's the weather reporter is there on the Brighton Pier, south coast of England. Huge rollers coming in behind her, pouring rain. And she says, you know, I don't remember her real name, but I'm Jane Smith signing off from Brighton Pier, where it is not overly safe. So one of the big challenges for me is adjusting to that understatement, because you can imagine what the American broadcasters would say, you know. But the other one is tricky, is these things. So they're not cell phones, they're called mobile phones. And you think about that phrase for a second, mobile phone. Back in the 70s, when some of us were growing up, mobile phones was an oxymoron, right? Phones were many things. They were red over in the UK in boxes, they were on every street corner here in New York. Anything but mobile, chained to your desk, chained to the wall. Now, for my kids, mobile telephone is redundant. They've never met a phone that isn't mobile, right? But what we've all been through together is this journey from oxymoron to redundancy. And I think about that for today's discussion around digital diplomacy. I mean, there are a bunch of people, wind back the clock not too far, and some today, who would argue that digital diplomacy is an oxymoron. Proper diplomacy happens behind closed doors, usually where you have to leave your cell phone outside, right? That's where real diplomacy happens. Others look forward to a day when that phrase will be redundant. I mean, digital is part of all of our lives now, and so too it will be with diplomacy. But right now, today, we're in this interesting middle between oxymoron and redundancy. So I wanted to share with you sort of field notes, if you will, from my experiences thus far, reflect a little bit on diplomacy, digital, and then maybe at the end a thought about age, which I think is important. So diplomacy. So I was at a dinner party the other night in London, and I got seated next to this famous comedian. So think, his name is Jimmy Carr. He's sort of famous over there, like sort of a Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert guy, but he's also a stand-up comic. Sitting there at dinner, I knew him a little bit, but I was excited, and I had this question I always wanted to ask a stand-up comedian, and I never had the chance, so this was my chance. He's sitting right to the left of me, and I said, Jimmy, let's say you're trying out new material, and you get up there in front of an audience, and let's say you leave London, because that's a tough crowd, but you go to Leeds or someplace sort of in the middle. And you're trying out 10 new jokes. How many get a laugh when you first try them out? Any stand-up comedians here? Okay. So he says, well, like now? Like I'm really good. I'm at the top of my game. I was like, yeah, Jimmy, now. And he said, now I'll get 3 laughs out of 10. So I was like, that's really cool. Okay, that's good, because one of the things we're trying to do at the embassy is increase our ability to take risks. And it's a sort of a risk-averse culture for a lot of good reasons, but so I thought, wow, 3 out of 10, you know, like in baseball, that's good, but in little else is 3 out of 10 a good score. So I'm sort of done with Jimmy. He has given me the answer I want. But then he sort of taps me on the shoulder and he says, Matthew, you know, jokes are funny things. And he's like, no, I didn't mean it that way. He's like, jokes are interesting things. And I said, or strange things. And I was like, well, tell me why. And he said, well, if you sing a song and nobody likes it, it's still a song. And if you put on a play and everybody walks out, it's still a play. But if you tell a joke and nobody laughs, it's just a sentence. And I was like, turned back to Jimmy. I was like, wow. I was like, that's real. I was like, have you said that before? He's like, I've never said that before. I was like, do I have permission to quote you? And he said, sure. I don't know why you would. And I was like, I think that's actually very profound for the work that we are trying to do in diplomacy. Because his point was, the joke is it's more than a two-way thing. You say the sentence, there's laughter on the good ones, and this third thing is created, the actual joke. And if you don't believe me, not here, but go Google, someone uploaded a Bill Cosby, who's been in the news, a Bill Cosby stand-up routine and edited out all the laughter. And it is really, I'm diplomatic, I'll just say, it's worth watching. And it really proves this point, to watch what it's like if you take the laughter out. And so I think about digital diplomacy, and you know, tweeting is an obvious thing you do. I do a fair amount of it. I'm sure lots of people here in the room do. And I think, wow, at its best, you get this response, and it's maybe rises to the level of what he means by a joke. But how often are we just sending out 140-character sentences at people? You know? And what's our hit rate? And are we as good as Jimmy at 3 out of 10? I wonder. So that's some of how I think about diplomacy. As it relates to digital, quick trivia question. A major business school, it shall remain nameless because of where we are, put out a case study about the company that went digital and beat Encyclopedia Britannica, like a 300-year-old, you know, famous brand. Do you know what it was? Yeah, usually we get the guess, which we did up front here, Wikipedia. It is a good answer. It is not the right answer, but thank you for playing along. Yes, it's Microsoft Encarta. And I love this. So Microsoft, which at the time was the richest country in the world in terms of market capitalization, decides to go beat Britannica at what it does best. And it goes purely digital, right? And it pays the same amount or slightly more, I think, than Britannica paid people. And it's rigorous, and it's in its process, and they build it up. Do you remember them on CD-ROMs, right? So they go do it. And for something like 6 months, they actually do beat Britannica. But of course, how many of you have used Encarta in the last year? They finally stopped doing it. How many of you used Encyclopedia Britannica in the last year? Some of us? Okay. How many of you used Wikipedia? How many of you have found a mistake? How many will use it again anyway? Okay, just checking. And so it turns out that the guy who founded Wikipedia is Jimmy Wales. He lives about 3 blocks away from our embassy in London. He's been very generous to us, and he comes in and talks to our young diplomats. And he shared with them this amazing story, which you all may know, but it didn't start out as Wikipedia. Do you know the story? So he goes out there, he calls it Newpedia, and this is the 90s, so everything is, so it's N-U, capital P, but one word. Remember when that was all the rage? So it's like Newpedia. And his model is almost what it is today with one important difference. He goes out and he's going to not pay anyone. That was always part of the model. Can you imagine being in that pitch meeting? I'm going to go beat Britannica, 300-year-old company. I'm going to go beat Microsoft, the richest company in the world with the best engineers and unlimited budget. And I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to pay anyone anything. So he didn't have a lot of people excited about the project. But he said, you know what? Everyone's going to be gunning for me, and because I'm the new kid on the block, and I'm not paying anyone anything. So I have to be twice as paranoid about quality. So Britannica and Encarta have like a 5-step process to get an article approved. Jimmy's like, we're going to do 10. So he has 10 steps you have to get through to get an article done. Double peer reviewed. I mean, it's very academic and rigorous and hard. So at the end of 1 year of Newpedia, they had 9 articles. 9. Jimmy's also good at math. He did some simple math, and there was just no way that was going to work. Oh, and by the way, one of his 9 articles completely plagiarized through his double paranoid set of steps. Right, so then some young person on his team comes up and tells him about this thing called Wiki, right, where you can edit on the fly. And so, you know, the rest is history. He goes with that model. And it has become, and I hadn't heard this phrase before, but I love it, the greatest knowledge transfer engine in the history of the world. Complete with a bunch of mistakes. Guess what? Encarta had a bunch of mistakes. Britannica had a lot of mistakes, but you're just not going to go reprint your whole bookshelf when you find a mistake. But it keeps getting better, and it keeps improving. And so I think the lesson I take from that is Encarta was digital. That's not what's so interesting, and we use that word digital. They were purely digital. What they weren't was networked. They didn't ask other people for help. They tasked people with assignments. And so I try to reflect that in my work at the embassy. And I just want to share with you 3 things that we're doing right now at the embassy, inspired by Jimmy and his joke, and the other Jimmy, and networked versus digital, and then open it up for suggestions and questions. Sound good? All right, so one thing I've done trying to put this into practice is I have been to 109 high schools all around the UK. I meet with 100 students at a time, or sometimes 200, just almost exactly like this. And my hunch was going into this job that maybe British kids that age wouldn't be as supportive of the United States as the older generation. I mean, you could call them the 9/11 generation, but they were 4, right? I mean, that's like asking me to have a deep resonance with the Vietnam War or the oil crisis in the 1970s. I knew it went on, but like I have no resonance with it. And maybe less clear memories about the Cold War and World War II and all that stuff. So I wanted to reach out and hear what's on these kids' minds. And so I did, and then it turns out that Pew, the wonderful people at Pew, just put out a American opinion survey of what people all around Europe think of America. And in every single country but one, young people, sort of that age group, have a more favorable opinion of the United States than the older generation. And it's either like +2 or +4 percentage points, or in some cases +14 percentage points higher, except for the UK, -9. So clearly it hasn't been very effective. But that was a joke, which got no laughter. That was a sentence. And my other hunch was, if you went and talked to 18-year-olds, as opposed to talking to people at universities. And when you go to universities and you get a group like this together, the people who show up, bless all of you and all of us, tend to be people really interested in foreign policy. So the questions, they want to talk about drones, and they want to talk about surveillance in Guantanamo Bay and Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and Syria, all these important things that we as diplomats are trained to talk about, we talk about every day, and so we're happy to engage. But I was like, do 18-year-olds, would they raise the same things? So I don't give them a lecture, I just give them a card like this big and a pencil, and I say, draw me a picture, please, of something that frustrates, concerns, or confuses you about the United States and what we're up to. And I always get a panicked look, usually from a young man who's like, I'm hopeless at drawing. I was like, you can just write a word if you want to write a word. So they do all that, and then we talk about it. And and then we write up what they wrote, and 2/3 of the issues they want to talk about aren't foreign policy at all. They're all what you would think of as domestic policy. The big one is guns, so half the kids draw a picture of a handgun. Police violence, racism, and they do get to drones, Guantanamo, that stuff too, but much less than these other things. So that was a big learning for us at the embassy around what to do there. The other thing we tried to do is, early on when I got to the UK, I sat down, it was a sort of Chamber of Commerce kind of event, and I was all briefed up to get through my Senate testimony, and I know about our amazing investing relationship between the US and the UK, and we're each other's #1 foreign direct investors, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're sitting at this business dinner, and this is this well-known British business guy sitting like 2 away from me, and I'm sort of pitching him on this, and I'm trying to get him excited to talk about transatlantic trade and investment partnership, uncleverly named TTIP. No hint of an A in there that it's transatlantic. But anyway, so I'm kind of pitching it. I'm basically like, let's talk about this. And in a sort of nice way, he says, let's not. I was like, oh, okay. And then the conversation drifts on. And then he says, he sort of put his hand, he's like, he didn't say son, but you could, it was implied. Son, do you want to actually be helpful? And I was like, okay, yes, I do. I mean, desperately. And he said, I'll tell you what you can do. I travel to your country 5 or more times a year. So he's a British passport holder. 5 more times a year for business. Every time I show up, it's like they've never met me. It's inconvenient. And I could tell he wanted to open up. I mean, there had been lots of wine at this point. And he says, it's infuriating. And I had learned enough of British understatement to adjust for if he's willing to say infuriating and it's not overly convenient, it's actually infuriating. I was like, wow, okay. So I went and did a little digging. So I talked to my team at the embassy, and it turns out, and then we got to work, and it's taken us 2 years, but our Customs and Border Protection team worked with the equivalent over there called the UK Border Force. They spent 2 years getting their systems to agree and talk to each other. So a week after next, we are announcing, we've already sort of announced it, that all UK citizens are now eligible for global entry. So instead of queuing up for what it can be, anyone gone through this? I mean, it can take, at JFK when things are bad, I mean, it can be, so you wait in the passport line, that can be an hour. Then you think you're finally done, you get your bag, and then you have the customs line, where all your job is to give that one piece of paper, and that could be another hour. So now it takes 45 seconds, right? 45 seconds. So that's something. And so if you have British friends, if you are British, by all means, spread the word. So the final thing we did is we changed what was called protocol, which is an important function at our embassy, and we renamed it, we re-envisioned it, we hired a new group of people to do something different, which is to connect all the amazing networks. We've got law enforcement networks, we have economic networks, all these things, but to connect them all together, because the real power of the internet, remember the internet used to be a verb back in the geeky old days of the 70s, it was internetworking. There were tons of computer networks, they just didn't talk to each other. So we've renamed it the Office of Network Engagement to try to get all these different groups actually talking and engaging and not in their individual silos. And all of that I actually did because of the advice I was given by my boss, President Obama, before I left for Sweden. And I sat down in his office. I knew him from the campaign, but he had just been elected president, and I got to go meet him in the Oval Office. I was a little nervous. I put on my coat and tie. We didn't dress like this in the internet days. Put on my coat and tie, go in there, we chat for a little bit, and we sit down. And I said, Mr. President, and that was just fun to say, Mr. President, I think it was maybe fun for him to hear too, because it was sort of new to him. What advice would you have for me as a first-time diplomat? And I don't think he was really expecting it. And he sort of sat back in his chair, and he said, well, Matthew, listen. And I was like, yeah, I was planning to. So I brought out my pen, and I used to have a little, like, the cool little moleskin little book, so I was like, waiting for his pearls of wisdom. But that's all he said. And it took me a second. You guys are quicker. I just sat there like, and so of course his advice was listen. Just listen. So I try to do that in Sweden. I'm trying to do that in the UK. And what I've discovered so far is that if you listen, people hear you differently. And that seems like a good time to now open it up so I can listen to you guys and would welcome any suggestions and questions you all have, and I think we'll go into this format here. So thank you.